There's something about silence that weighs more than words ever could. Not the comfortable kind of silence, the kind shared between friends on a long drive or the peaceful quiet of an empty house. I'm talking about the silence that comes from choosing not to speak when every fiber of your being knows you should. The silence that calculates risk and reward and decides that your own skin is worth more than the truth. That's the silence I want to talk about today because I've lived with it, and I'm starting to think it's changed me in ways I didn't fully understand until recently. I'm going to tell you about 3 moments in my life where I chose silence over action, where I saw something wrong and turned away, where I prioritized my own safety or comfort over doing what was right. And here's the thing that keeps me up at night, the thing that's been gnawing at me for years. I don't think these were isolated incidents. I think they revealed something about who I am, something I didn't want to see, something I'm still not sure I want to admit. The first time I understood the true cost of silence, I was 16 years old and standing in a tent in the middle of nowhere with my best friend Charles. We'd just gotten back from the stupidest, most reckless thing either of us had ever done, and we were lying there in our sleeping bags, hearts still pounding, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. But before I get to that moment, I need to take you back a bit further to help you understand how we ended up there in the first place. I've never been a camping person. Never understood the appeal of sleeping on rocks, swatting mosquitoes all night, and pretending that being uncomfortable somehow brings you closer to nature. But my dad, he's one of those people who thinks camping is the ultimate test of manhood, the kind of guy who measures your worth by how well you can start a fire or tie a bowline knot. Every summer when I was a kid, he'd drag me out into the woods with his equally outdoorsy friends, and I'd spend 3 or 4 days being miserable while they talked about how this was real living. By sophomore year of high school, I'd had enough. I convinced him to let me bring a friend, thinking that at least if I had to suffer, I could suffer with someone I actually liked. That's how Charles ended up coming along. Now Charles was a bit of a contradiction. He was a former Boy Scout, knew everything about camping, could pitch a tent in under 5 minutes and tell you which berries were poisonous just by looking at them. But he was also cool about the fact that I hated all of it. He didn't lecture me or make me feel like less of a person for preferring indoor plumbing and a real mattress. The trip was a disaster from the start. One of my dad's friends had screwed up the booking, and instead of some remote wilderness spot, we ended up at this overcrowded campsite that was more like a suburb with tents. There were paved walkways, indoor bathrooms, even a playground for little kids. My dad was furious, going on and on about how this wasn't real camping, and Charles kept making these passive-aggressive jokes about how my family clearly didn't know what real camping was supposed to look like. I had to tell him to knock it off because it was starting to piss me off. Just because I hated camping didn't mean I didn't know what it was supposed to be. But here's where it gets weird. Right next to our campsite, maybe a few 100 yards away, was a full-blown amusement park. I'm not talking about a few carnival games and a carousel. This place had roller coasters, a Ferris wheel, game booths, the works. It was surreal, like 2 completely different worlds had collided. An amusement park and a campground existing side by side in this bizarre symbiosis. Since we'd driven all that way and couldn't just turn around, we decided to make the best of it. The adults set up camp, still grumbling about the whole situation, and Charles and I got our tent up in record time. He was showing off a bit, tying all these perfect knots, getting everything staked down just right. Even my dad gave him this approving nod, which honestly kind of annoyed me. Once everything was set up and we'd eaten dinner, Charles and I slipped away to our tent under the excuse of organizing our stuff. The truth was, Charles had brought a little metal pipe and some weed hidden in an old Altoids tin. This was our delinquent phase, when we thought we were rebels and liked hanging out in places we weren't supposed to be. Looking back, I'm not even sure I actually liked smoking. I think I just did it because it felt like defiance, like I was asserting my independence or something equally stupid. We snuck into the woods behind our campsite and smoked, laughing at nothing and everything, feeling like we'd gotten away with something. We weren't worried about the smell because we figured we'd avoid the adults for the rest of the night anyway. After a couple hours back in the tent, just talking about school and friends and all the usual teenage nonsense, we both realized we had way too much energy to sleep. That's when Charles got this look on his face, this mischievous grin that I knew meant he was about to suggest something reckless. He said we should explore the amusement park. Not just walk around it, but actually break in and climb one of the roller coasters. We were really into climbing stuff back then, scaling buildings and trees and anything that seemed like a challenge. The idea of climbing a roller coaster, of being up there in the dark looking down at everything, that was too tempting to pass up. We waited until we were sure everyone was asleep, grabbed our flashlights, and headed out. It must have been after midnight by then. The fence around the park wasn't even that hard to get over. Charles gave me a boost and we were in, just like that. The park was dark except for a few security lights scattered around, and we could hear the hum of golf carts as guards made their rounds. It felt like we were in some kind of stealth video game, ducking behind buildings and timing our movements to avoid the patrols. It took us a while to make our way through the park, stopping and starting, sprinting across open areas when we had a clear shot. At one point we had to run across this wide stretch of pavement to avoid a guard who'd turned a corner unexpectedly. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. It was thrilling and terrifying all at once, this weird combination of feeling invincible and completely vulnerable. We finally made it to the base of the roller coaster, and from up close it looked massive, way bigger than it had seemed from the campsite. There were maintenance stairs running up alongside the main track, and we didn't even hesitate. We started climbing, trying to keep our footsteps quiet on the metal rungs. Some sections didn't have railings, which was genuinely terrifying, but we kept going. When we reached the top, the view was incredible. We could see the entire park spread out below us, all the rides and buildings lit up by those scattered security lights. We took one photo, just one, because we were paranoid about drawing attention to ourselves. If someone spotted us from below, we'd never be able to get away in time. Eventually we decided we'd pushed our luck far enough and started heading back down. The return trip was faster, maybe because the patrols had thinned out or maybe because we were more confident. We were about 5 minutes from the spot where we'd climbed the fence when we had to stop. A guard in a golf cart was making rounds, so we ducked behind this snack shack and waited for him to pass. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was just a shadow, maybe something from the golf cart's headlights bouncing off the buildings in a weird way. But then Charles tapped my arm and pointed in the same direction, and I realized it wasn't my imagination. About 30 feet away, barely visible in the darkness between two buildings, was another person. They were crouching down just like us, like they were also trying to avoid the guards. But it wasn't a kid. I could tell that much even in the dark. The worst part was that I was pretty sure they were looking directly at us. My stomach dropped. Between the guards and now this, the whole situation was getting overwhelming. We couldn't move yet because the guard still hadn't passed, so we just stayed there, frozen, watching this figure in the darkness. Then they started moving. They darted across this patch of open ground, and for just a second they passed through the light from a nearby street lamp. That's when I saw him clearly. It was a man, wearing torn, tattered clothing, moving with this weird, awkward stride like he was injured or maybe drunk. But what made my blood run cold was his face. There was something dark smeared all across it, dripping down his chin and neck. It looked like blood. A lot of blood. Charles saw it too. We locked eyes and I could see he was just as terrified as I was. The man ducked out of sight after that, disappearing back into the shadows. The guard finally passed us and we started moving again, not saying a word, not looking at each other. I kept checking over my shoulder every few seconds, convinced that we were being followed, that he was right behind us and we just couldn't see him yet. But there was never anyone there. We made it back to the fence, climbed over, and basically ran back to our tent. We didn't laugh about our adventure. We didn't congratulate ourselves on not getting caught. We just crawled into our sleeping bags and lay there, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. The best explanation we could come up with was that it was some homeless guy. Maybe he'd gotten into a fight or had some kind of accident. It was a stupid explanation, I know, but we couldn't think of anything else that made sense. The next morning started normally. We got up, ate breakfast, started packing our gear to go fishing. Then around 10 o'clock, one of the campsite staffers came around with an announcement. A man had been stabbed and killed the night before at a lake about 4 miles away from where we were. The guy who did it was still on the loose, and they were asking everyone within a certain radius to be on high alert. They described him as a disheveled white male in his late 30s, shirtless, possibly bleeding or with blood on his clothes. Then they told us to pack up and leave for our own safety. Charles and I knew immediately. It had to be him, the man we'd seen in the amusement park. We'd been 30 feet away from a murderer crouching behind a snack shack while he crouched between buildings, both of us trying to avoid being seen but for very different reasons. And here's the part I'm not proud of, the part that still makes me feel sick when I think about it. We didn't say anything. Not to my dad, not to the rangers, not to the police. We just kept our mouths shut and packed up our stuff and left. I still don't really know why we stayed silent. I mean, I know why in the moment. We were scared of getting in trouble for breaking into the amusement park, for smoking weed, for all the stupid things we'd done that night. But that doesn't justify it. Nothing justifies it. My statement could have helped them catch him faster. Maybe it wouldn't have mattered, maybe they caught him anyway, but I'll never know. And I have to live with the fact that I chose protecting myself over doing the right thing. Charles and I are still close. We went to the same college, work in similar fields, see each other regularly, but we almost never talk about that night. I think it bothers him more than it bothers me, which maybe says something about me that I don't want to admit. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we'd crossed paths with him in a different way, if he'd seen us more clearly, if he'd decided we were a threat or witnesses who needed to be silenced. We were just kids doing something stupid, and we came within feet of someone who'd just taken another person's life. That realization, that understanding of how close we came to something truly terrible, that should have been enough to make me speak up. But it wasn't. The second time I learned about the weight of silence was different. It was faster, more immediate, less ambiguous. I was still 16, a junior in high school, and it was October of 2016, right when that weird clown hysteria was all over the news. You probably remember it if you're around my age. People were posting creepy clown sightings all across the country, most of them obviously fake, people just trying to get attention or scare their friends. But there were real cases too, genuinely disturbing incidents that made the whole thing feel less like a joke and more like something darker. I had just finished my last class of the day and said goodbye to my friends. I hopped on the 6 train heading uptown, planning to get off at 96th Street and walk home from there. It was a route I'd taken hundreds of times, so routine that I barely paid attention anymore. The train was mostly empty, which was a little unusual but not weird enough to worry about. I had my headphones in, blasting music, probably Drake, and I was reviewing chemistry flashcards on my phone. I was about as unaware of my surroundings as humanly possible, which is never a good idea when you're traveling alone, but I knew the area well enough that it felt safe. When we arrived at 96th, I jumped up instinctively, barely even looking to confirm it was the right station. Getting on and off had become such a reflex that I didn't need to think about it anymore. I made my way to the doors with my head still buried in my phone, music still blasting in my ears. But as soon as the doors slid open, I realized something was blocking my path. I looked up, and standing directly in the doorway was a clown. He was wearing the full costume, oversized rainbow pants, a baggy yellow shirt with red suspenders, giant red shoes that looked like they belonged in a cartoon. His face was covered in white makeup, red nose, blue eyebrows, the whole exaggerated nightmare look. The only thing missing was a wig. I just stood there, completely frozen, caught so off guard that I couldn't process what I was seeing. I'd never been that close to something so bizarre, so out of place. He didn't say anything. He just stood there in the doorway, not trying to get on the train, but clearly preventing me from getting off. I snapped out of my shock and realized I had maybe 5 seconds before the doors closed, so I had to move. I tried to brush past him, but the moment I made contact, he leaned down in one fluid motion, bringing his face right up to mine like he wanted to make sure we were eye to eye. Before he could grab me or do whatever he was planning, I sprinted past him. That's when he lunged forward, trying to tackle me. I dodged and kept running, and I could hear him chasing me. It was absolutely terrifying. The station was essentially empty in the early afternoon, so there was no one around to help, no one to see what was happening. I shot a glance behind me and saw him pursuing me with this jerky, unnatural stride, his limbs moving like they were disproportionate or broken. And that's when I saw what was in his hand. A kitchen knife. I didn't know where he'd been hiding it or what he planned to do with it, but I didn't stick around to find out. I ran up the stairs and out of the station and immediately found a police officer and reported what had happened. The clown didn't follow me onto the street, but I was shaking so badly I could barely get the words out. The police sent someone down to the station, but he was gone by then. They took my statement, tried to reassure me that I was safe, but I couldn't shake this irrational thought that he somehow knew where I lived and was going to track me down later. Obviously that didn't happen. Nothing else happened at all, actually. I'm sure my story ended up on the news as one of the many strange clown encounters of that year, just another data point in a weird cultural moment. But for weeks afterward, I was a paranoid wreck, jumping at shadows, checking over my shoulder constantly. It took me a long time to feel safe on the subway again. Here's the thing about that incident, though. I did everything right. I ran, I reported it, I gave the police all the information I had. There was no silence, no choice to look away or protect myself at someone else's expense. It was clear-cut, straightforward, the kind of situation where the right choice was obvious and I made it. So why does it still bother me? Why does it fit into this pattern I'm trying to understand? Because it made me realize something about the camping trip, about that night with Charles. When I was being chased by that clown, I didn't think about whether reporting him would get me in trouble. I didn't calculate the risks to myself. I just reacted, did what I knew was right without hesitation. So why couldn't I do that when it mattered more? Why could I speak up when a stranger on a subway chased me, but not when I had information that could help catch a murderer? The answer, I think, is that on the subway I was the victim. There was no moral ambiguity, no question of whether I should involve myself. But at the campsite, I was just a witness to something adjacent to a crime. I hadn't seen the murder, hadn't seen the man do anything violent. I'd just seen him hiding, just like we were hiding. And that distance, that separation from the actual crime, gave me room to rationalize staying silent. It gave me the space to prioritize my own interests over doing what was right. The third and final story I want to tell you is different from the first two. It's longer, more complicated, and if I'm being honest, it's the one that scares me the most. Because in this case, my silence wasn't just about avoiding trouble or protecting myself from immediate danger. It was about money, about comfort, about the slow, gradual process of becoming complicit in something I knew was wrong, all while telling myself it wasn't really my responsibility. I was 2 years out of undergrad when this happened, technically enrolled in an online graduate certificate program, but with way too much free time on my hands. I was bouncing from one odd job to another, trying to find anything that would pay the bills and keep me busy. I spent most of my nights scrolling through Indeed, looking for the next gig. Door dashing had gotten old, driving around the same neighborhoods for minimum wage, so I was actively looking for something different. That's when I found the listing. It was for a private lifeguarding job at a hotel a few towns over. The basic description was normal enough, but there were a few details that gave me pause. First, the hours were backwards. Instead of opening in the morning and closing in the evening like any normal pool, they wanted someone to work from 5 p.m. to 1 a.m. during the week. Essentially a night shift for a swimming pool, which didn't make much sense. But here's what really caught my attention. The requirements explicitly stated that they wanted someone who didn't speak Spanish. Let me repeat that. They specifically wanted someone who didn't speak Spanish. This was a problem for me because I've been speaking Spanish since I was a kid. I'm half Mexican, grew up speaking it at home with my mom, and the town where this hotel was located had a predominantly Spanish-speaking population, so the requirement seemed bizarre, almost nonsensical. Nothing about the listing made sense to me, but there was one thing that did make sense, one detail that made me decide to apply anyway. $30 an hour, which back then was an insane amount of money for what seemed like a pretty straightforward job. I decided I would just pretend not to know Spanish. I mean, what were they going to do? I heard back within a few hours and was invited to interview. When I showed up at the hotel on my first day, everything looked exactly like you'd expect. This friendly, pudgy Mexican-looking guy came out to greet me, and we hit it off immediately. He was funny, personable, put me at ease. His name was Esteban, and he seemed genuinely happy to have me there. But as we were walking into the complex, another guy turned a corner and started staring me down. He was taller, more serious, and I could tell right away that I was being profiled. He walked right up to me and started speaking in Spanish. He didn't smile, didn't introduce himself, didn't shake my hand. He just started talking, clearly testing whether I understood. I gave him a blank stare even though I understood every word. He was just making small talk about the weather, nothing important, but it was obvious what he was doing. After a few seconds of me looking confused, the two of them burst out laughing like they'd been in on some practical joke together. The taller guy, who introduced himself as Heath, smiled and shook my hand and said he was just messing with me. I went along with it, laughed it off, but I was already weirded out. Heath walked me through the job as we headed to the pool. He explained that they wanted to increase revenue by keeping the pool open later and charging non-guests to use it. I wasn't sure if that was even legal, but I wasn't about to complain. My responsibilities were simple. Lifeguard, collect money from non-guests, and call Heath if there were any problems. Then he added one more thing. If anyone showed me a blue wristband, I was to let them into what he called the pool house, which was this large building behind the lifeguard stand. I didn't ask questions. I just nodded and said I understood. The first few weeks were actually pretty chill. Lots of people used the pool, more than I expected, and I collected money from outsiders and kept an eye on everyone in the water. No one showed me a wristband during that time. Then about a month in, this buff Hispanic guy in sunglasses and a white button-down shirt walked up to me. He didn't speak any English, just showed me his wristband. I unlocked the pool house and he went inside. About an hour later, he came out and left. His backpack looked significantly more full than when he'd arrived, but other than that, everything seemed normal. Over the next few weeks, more and more people started showing me wristbands. Sometimes they came alone, sometimes in groups. And more non-guests started using the pool too, which meant I was collecting way more money than I had been initially. At one point I realized that people were consistently overpaying me by crazy amounts. Like someone would hand me $300 for a $20 pool entry fee. I called Heath about it, and he told me not to worry, that people made mistakes all the time. But I could tell he didn't want to talk about it because he hung up while I was mid-sentence. That's when it really hit me. That short, dismissive phone call confirmed what I'd been trying not to think about. I was involved in something illegal. Money laundering was the only explanation that made sense. I didn't know what to do. Part of me knew I should quit immediately, get out before things got worse. But another part of me didn't want to give up $30 an hour based on a suspicion I couldn't prove. So I kept my mouth shut and kept showing up for work. Once I started paying attention, it all became obvious. The pool house was clearly where the shady stuff happened. Drugs, gambling, who knows what else. It was all happening right behind me every single day, separated by nothing but a locked door. Patrons started getting friendlier with me, especially the wristband wearers. They learned my name, started tipping me on top of the hourly wage, greeting me with high fives and smiles. As they got more comfortable, they started talking in front of me, having conversations in Spanish that they assumed I couldn't understand. That's how I confirmed everything. I'd catch pieces of their conversations, enough to know exactly what was going on. My hands were clean, technically. I was just doing the job I was hired to do. But I knew what was happening, and I stayed anyway because the money was good and the work was easy and people treated me well. Then one day I had to jump in and save a drowning kid. It wasn't anything heroic, just a child who'd wandered too far into the deep end and clearly couldn't swim. When I got him back to the surface, everyone at the pool gave me a standing ovation. It felt incredible. Heath came down from wherever he'd been in the hotel and thanked me personally, said I'd saved his son's life. The next day, Heath and Esteban and a bunch of other guys, including several of the wristband wearers, were waiting at the gate to greet me with a glass of wine. They made a toast to me, everyone clinking glasses and congratulating me. Then one of the men made another toast in Spanish. I don't remember the exact words, but the gist of it was clear. He was toasting all the money they were making and all the lives they were destroying. Everyone laughed and drank, and that was the moment I realized just how deep I was in something seriously dangerous. No amount of money should have kept me there. No amount of tips and free drinks and friendly greetings should have justified me staying. But I had. I'd gotten comfortable. I'd gotten addicted to the attention and the easy money and the feeling of being part of something, even if that something was fundamentally wrong. The next day, my mom called me while I was at the pool. My mom only ever called for important things, so I had to answer. I walked over to what I thought was a private corner so I could have some privacy. My mom only spoke Spanish, so naturally I talked to her in Spanish. I don't even remember what she called about. What I do remember is that when I hung up and turned around, Esteban was standing right behind me, staring at me with this cold expression I'd never seen before. After a really long, uncomfortable pause, he asked how long I'd known Spanish. I tried to play it off, said I was just practicing with a friend, but I knew he didn't believe me. He just kept staring, and I could see him calculating something in his head. My heart was racing. I genuinely thought he might hurt me right there. Eventually he just said okay and turned around and walked away. I went back to my post, but I was terrified. I thought about leaving but couldn't make myself move. What if they took that as a sign of guilt? What if I was failing some kind of test? What if they knew where I lived? All these thoughts raced through my mind as I sat there, frozen in that chair, praying that I'd make it through the shift. A few minutes before I was supposed to leave, Heath came up to me and told me to arrive an hour early the next day because he had a new opportunity to offer me. Then he tipped me a couple $100 and walked back into the hotel. I never went back. I couldn't. There was no way that situation had a good ending. For months afterward, I was a paranoid wreck. Every unfamiliar car on my street made me nervous. There were nights where I stayed awake for hours, convinced that someone was going to come after me. Even now, years later, I still don't fully understand parts of what happened. Why did they need a lifeguard at all? My best guess is that they just needed someone on payroll who could act clueless if the police ever showed up, someone who could legitimately claim they didn't know what was happening. I genuinely believe I was close to losing my life that day. The way Esteban looked at me, the way he calculated whether or not I was a threat, I think I barely passed whatever test he was running, and I got out just in time. So those are my 3 stories. 3 moments where I chose silence, where I saw something wrong and either didn't speak up or stayed involved longer than I should have. And here's what I've come to understand about myself through all of this. The first time, at the campsite with Charles, I had a clear moral obligation to speak and I didn't. The fear of getting in trouble, of facing consequences for my own stupid choices, that outweighed my responsibility to help catch a dangerous person. That silence was pure cowardice, and I have to own that. The second time, on the subway, I did the right thing. I spoke up immediately, reported what happened, didn't hesitate. But that was easy because I was the victim, because there was no moral complexity, no grey area where I could tell myself it wasn't my problem. The third time, at the hotel, is the one that haunts me the most. Because I didn't just stay silent about something I witnessed. I actively participated. I showed up every day, collected money, unlocked doors, played my part in something I knew was illegal and harmful. And I did it for money. I did it because it was comfortable, because people were nice to me, because $30 an hour felt too good to walk away from. I justified it by telling myself my hands were clean, that I was just doing a job, that I wasn't responsible for what other people chose to do. But that's not true. I was complicit. Every day I showed up was another day I endorsed what was happening, another day I chose my own comfort over doing what was right. And here's the really terrifying part, the thing that keeps me awake at night. I think these 3 incidents revealed something fundamental about who I am. I think they showed me that when faced with a moral choice, when forced to decide between doing what's right and protecting myself, I will almost always choose self-preservation. Not because I'm a bad person, not because I don't know right from wrong, but because in the moment, when it really matters, my fear is stronger than my principles. I look at these 3 stories and I see a pattern. I see someone who knows what the right thing to do is but consistently fails to do it. Someone who can rationalize almost anything if it means avoiding discomfort or consequences. Someone who, given enough incentive, can learn to ignore almost anything. That's not the person I want to be. It's not the person I thought I was. But it might be the person I actually am. Charles and I have never really talked about what happened at the campsite, about the choice we made that night. I think he feels more guilty than I do, which probably says something about both of us. But I wonder sometimes if he sees the pattern too, if he looks back at that moment and realizes it was formative in some way, that it taught us both something about ourselves we didn't want to learn. I never found out what happened with the hotel, whether they got busted or are still operating or moved on to some other scheme. Part of me doesn't want to know because then I'd have to confront whether my silence allowed something to continue that should have been stopped. I'm telling you all this because I think we don't talk enough about moral failure, about the small ways we compromise our values, about the gradual process of becoming someone we don't want to be. We tell stories about heroes who make the right choice, who stand up when it matters, who refuse to be complicit no matter the cost. But most of us aren't heroes. Most of us are just trying to get through the day without making things worse for ourselves. And maybe that's okay on some level. Maybe we can't all be moral paragons, can't all risk everything for abstract principles. But I think we should at least be honest about it. We should at least acknowledge when we've failed, when we've chosen wrong, when we've let fear or greed or comfort guide our decisions instead of conscience. I don't know if I've learned anything from these experiences. I'd like to think I have, that if faced with similar situations now I'd make different choices. But I'm not sure that's true. I think about the person I was in each of those moments, the calculations I made, the rationalizations I constructed, and I'm not confident that older, supposedly wiser version of myself would behave any differently. Maybe that's the most honest thing I can say, that I know what the right thing to do is, that I can articulate it clearly, explain it to others, even judge people who fail to do it. But when it comes down to it, when I'm the one who has to take the risk or pay the price or face the consequences, I'm not sure I can be trusted to do the right thing. That's a hard truth to live with. It's the weight of silence, the burden of choices not made, of words not spoken. It follows me around, shows up in quiet moments, makes me question whether I'm really the person I present myself as being. And I suspect I'm not alone in this. I suspect a lot of us carry similar weights, similar silences, similar failures that we don't talk about because acknowledging them means confronting uncomfortable truths about ourselves. So that's my confession, my admission of moral failure across 3 different moments in my life. I wish I could tell you I've changed, that I've become someone who always does the right thing regardless of personal cost. But I don't know if that's true. All I know is that I remember these moments, that they've shaped me in ways I'm still trying to understand, and that the silence I chose back then still echoes in ways I never expected. The weight of what we don't say, it turns out, is heavier than almost anything we could speak aloud, and I'm still learning how to carry it.